Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming today. My name is Lorelei Root. I'm a white female with blonde hair in her early 30s, and I'm a digital accessibility specialist. In my career, I have a specific focus on video game accessibility, but I've worked with many companies making sure that their digital content is accessible. Currently, I work for a corporate training company here in Guelph called Eagles Flight, making sure that their digital experiential learning is as accessible as possible. I'm also the chair of the Accessibility Advisory Committee for the City of Guelph. I'm the chair of the Municipal Elections Subcommittee for the City of Guelph. And also for the city, I'm an accessibility liaison for site planning. So I help make sure that any site plans submitted to the city meet accessibility standards of the FADM and other accessibility regulations. I'm a member of the board of directors for the Canadian Centre for Disability Studies. I serve on a number of boards and committees in an accessibility advisory capacity, but perhaps my most significant qualification for speaking to you on this topic today is that I'm a disabled woman who plays video games and who's worked in game development. So that really allows me to tap into the needs of my community from the inside and come at these things from a perspective of lived experience, which I think is really important. So I'm going to give an overview of what we're going to be talking about today, but in order to do that, I really need to explain what I mean by beyond the mechanics. So when I say that, basically I'm talking about areas that need accessibility, but that are outside the code of a game. So outside of the actual gameplay mechanics. I want to note also that I'm speaking specifically about video games today, but all of these techniques and teachings are able to be applied to pretty much any content that's aimed at consumers. So whether it's your company's marketing materials or internal corporate initiatives, or even educational materials, or any public-facing content like a website, these are some foundational principles that I try to take with me, regardless of the job that I'm working on. So even if game development isn't your area, I'm certain you can take away some key learnings from the presentation today that you can apply in your own individual field. So beyond the mechanics, often when I'm hired to consult on a video game, the developers will have a very specific barrier that they want me to address. Lorelei, we want you to help us implement colorblind mode. We want you to make this video game more accessible to people with motor function challenges. They want me to focus on the mechanics and identify what changes they need to make to the actual programming and code of the technical aspects of gameplay. So they often end up seeming fairly shocked and even resistant when I bring up the sort of topics that I'd like to discuss today, when I notice barriers in these other areas. As a result, the things that I'm here to discuss today are things that are often left out of the conversation, but are still vitally important if the goal is to create a truly accessible gaming experience. A disabled user's experience doesn't start when we turn a game on and stop when we turn a game off, right? There are things that we still need to think about outside of the game itself if we want to truly include disabled people in the gaming community. Okay, so we're going to cover 4 areas of focus in this talk today. I'll get into each of these in much more detail, but I'm just going to give you a brief explanation right now. Today, we're going to talk about language, concept, tone, and culture as they pertain to game development. So what I mean by that is with language, I'm basically talking about what are the things that we're saying to and about disabled people with the words that we're using in the game. When I talk about concept, I'm talking about, was the decision to include accessibility a part of the game design concept from square one? And also a big piece of concept is whether or not disability is represented in the game. When I talk about tone, the main point that we're going to discuss is whether or not representation is happening in a good, productive, helpful way. And then culture, is the culture of the game development studio one that keeps accessibility in mind, even outside of the actual game itself? Avoiding things like an ableist corporate culture, for example, and I have some tips on that. So let's start the conversation off with concept and tone, because these 2 points are very foundational and they kind of build off one another. So concept, when I'm talking about concept, I'm saying are disability and accessibility top of mind from the very earliest stages of development. It's easier for us to narrow in on the specifics and create a truly accessible game when we're already working off a larger foundation of having started with an accessible framework. A big part of that is the decision to make accessibility a priority before a single line of code is ever even written. Intentionally setting accessibility as a key focus from the initial point of concept will massively affect the accessibility of the final product. This can look like bringing in accessibility consultants right at the beginning, or preferably hiring a permanent team of accessibility specialists to stay on staff and advise on disability-related concerns for every project at every stage. It can also look like making sure that it's clearly communicated to every department involved that you aim to make inclusion an intentional part of the design at every step. Not only is this going to result in an overall more accessible game, it's also just a lot more cost effective to design with inclusion in mind from day one, because it saves you the money of having to go back and course correct or make a bunch of changes to work that was already done. My next point about concept is about representation. Research has shown that representation in media is so important for emotional development, especially for children and teens and young adults, which are key demographics when it comes to video games. We very rarely see disabled characters represented in gaming, and when we do, that representation often does more harm than good to the community if it isn't implemented in an appropriate way. So it's important to keep in mind whether or not you've got any disability representation in your game. Are there characters with disabilities, for example? But that brings us to tone, because just representing characters with disabilities isn't enough. It's important to also represent them well. So with tone, we need to consider, how are you representing disability? Is it respectful? That in a respectful way that doesn't alienate or tokenize? For example, are all of the disabled characters in a game villains or helpless victims who need to be saved or goofy sidekicks? Is their disability used as a joke or a punchline? Are they looked at as only symbols of hope in overcoming adversity and symbols of strength because, oh, look how strong they are overcoming their awful disability? Are they simply written in as token characters for diversity points, or are they full, multifaceted characters with rich personalities and traits that add to the depth of the story? Some of these tokenizing tropes that I'm mentioning might not seem very harmful, but they truly are. They feed into a greater stigma in society that puts disabled people at real measurable risk. For example, the trope that disabled people are so strong for getting through their horrible disability, this feeds into the mistaken belief that disabled people have a lower quality of life, which thereby puts us in real measurable danger. When people think we have a lower quality of life, they also tend to think our lives have less worth. We saw this a lot during the pandemic, where people just didn't care about folks who were more vulnerable. I'm sure I'm not the only one who heard people saying things like, oh, it's okay, we don't have to worry about this new virus because most of us will just get a cold. It's only the sick and elderly people who are going to die. And as someone without a properly functioning immune system, it was really scary to realize how many people truly seem to believe that my life has less worth than theirs. I had to come to terms with hearing people going around and reassuring one another that they would be okay because only people like me would die. These tropes, feeding into the belief that our lives have less value, it factors into other areas of our lives as well that are potentially dangerous. Things like they factor in with triaging, with medically assisted deaths. There are legislative decisions being made regularly based on the incorrect assumption that disabled people have a lower quality of life. And one way we can tackle society's incorrect assumptions about us is by making sure that disability representation we're exposing them to is not feeding into these tropes. So that's just one example of one of these tropes and how it's harmful, but all of them are examples of disrespectful representation. And all of them are harmful because of what they teach the world about disabled people. Okay, the next point about how we represent disability is it in a realistic way? Similar to respectful, but still different. Often disability is represented in a very unrealistic way, usually because it's often being written into stories by people who've never experienced it firsthand. It's important to get feedback from the communities that we're trying to represent in order to do it in a realistic way. For example, so often in the media, any form of media, disability is presented as so black and white. It's either someone is completely blind or they see perfectly all of the time, 20/20 vision. Other types of low vision, people who fall anywhere other than those two extreme ends of the vast spectrum of vision are just not represented. I've never seen a character like me in a TV show or movie or video game, someone who walks and sometimes uses a wheelchair. I can't think of a single example of ever seeing that in any form of media. And yet it's very common. It's called being an ambulatory wheelchair user, and it's actually the reality for most of us who use a wheelchair. It's estimated that upwards of 80% of wheelchair users can walk or stand to some extent. And it's actually not all that common to have a disability that makes you need to rely solely on a wheelchair for mobility. And again, this is important because sometimes non-disabled people's only exposure to, or at least their primary source of exposure to disabled people, is the representation that they see in the media. And when they meet a person in real life who doesn't live up to that picture that they have in their mind of what it means to be disabled, it can be harmful or even dangerous. Um, I have been assaulted in a pharmacy by a man who saw me stand up to reach something out of my wheelchair. And anytime people see me walking and then see me in my wheelchair, more than half of the time, they will assume that that therefore means I'm faking needing my wheelchair. And this man saw me stand up to reach something. And because he didn't understand that just because I use a wheelchair doesn't mean I can't stand, he got really angry because he immediately jumped to, oh, she must be faking. And then he jumped to, oh, if she's faking, it must be for something. She must be trying to get money. She's probably either scamming an insurance company, which harms real disabled people, or she's stealing my tax money and pretending to be disabled. And I wasn't on any social assistance at the time, not that there's anything wrong with that. Um, and it just was such a leap, and I was so shocked, and he didn't explain any of this until after the assault had happened. In movies and TV and video games, people like me don't exist. So to some people, people like me don't exist. And we can combat that harmful narrative by having more realistic representation of disability. Which brings me to the final piece about implementing representation, which is the game accessible to the folks with the disabilities that you are representing? Games should be accessible to everyone, obviously, but definitely to the people whose experiences you are profiting off of. I consulted on a game once with a man who was blind, and he was giving feedback on the representation of a blind character in the game. And he said, yeah, this representation is done really well, but I can't play your video game. So you have some work to do because you're using my story and you're asking my community for feedback, and yet we can't access the game. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Moving on from those points, let's talk about language for a minute. One mistake I see game development companies making fairly often is including casually ableist language in the script of their game or in their marketing materials. The language choices that we make can impact whether or not a game is accessible to people with disabilities. Though often unintentional, it suggests that people with disabilities are abnormal in some way. So one common example I see is using disabilities as pejorative, calling someone dumb or lame, what are you, blind, things like that. Uh, you might not understand that, but as someone who goes to the doctor's office and hears the word lame to mean me, and then out in society hears people using the word lame to mean bad, it really does hit. It really does feel strange and difficult at times. Ableist language can seem like innocent language, and it's often used as a harmful or a harmless alternative to swearing. They're like, let's not swear, let's use these pejoratives like crazy and psycho, but these are actually still impacting many people heavily. So I urge everyone in the language choices that you're using in any area of life to kind of examine them and think about whether or not the words you're using to mean bad things are also names for disabilities, because there's a long list of pejorative words that are actually just disabilities. And avoiding this type of language is important because people with disabilities don't want to play games that make fun of us, even if it's not intentional. These are just some examples of ableist language. There are also terms that, as the language evolves, there are terms that are more outdated. Things that I hear frequently are handicapped or handy capable. So it's important to just kind of be aware of the changing language and make sure that you're mindful of what you're saying. Another point about language, and the biggest point I have about language, is actually around difficulty levels. Some common identifiers for gameplay modes in video games that you'll see are easy mode, normal mode, hard mode, extra hard mode. And this might not seem problematic at first, but let me get into why it actually is. Because in reality, what many game devs call difficulty settings, what many game devs call difficulty settings actually have very little to do with mere difficulty and a lot more to do with accessibility. Many of the features included in quote unquote easy modes are necessary in order for people with disabilities to play a game. Someone with limited motor function can benefit greatly from extended timers and more health. Someone playing a game using only their feet might find certain button combinations difficult or even impossible, and the option to skip boss fights or lower the difficulty of a level is crucial for them to be able to complete the game. Imagine hitting a certain point in a game that requires you to do something that you're physically incapable of doing, and then it's just game over for you halfway through the experience. After paying full price for a game, you just never get to complete it. So these game modes that developers are labeling as easy aren't always actually easy. And calling these game modes easy, medium, hard, it's inaccurate, but it also has a problematic social effect because in gaming communities, there's a lot of stigma attached to difficulty levels. Many people will have heard conversations about easy mode being for noobs and, yeah, you beat that game, but did you beat it on hard mode like a real gamer? Imagine being someone with a disability who gets shamed for completing a game on what the developers decided to call easy mode, but knowing you had a more difficult gameplay experience than probably 90% of users because you played it with no hands, or you played it with a sip and puff controller or an eye tracker mouse. When we feed into this idea with these inaccurate labels, we're actually allowing this culture of stigma to thrive. And it's a culture that turns around and directly affects the game industry as well. I've seen the stigma cause game developers to entirely remove easy modes from their games because gamers ask for that. They want to keep people that they deem fake gamers from claiming completion of a game that they completed on hard mode. And, in order to foster a culture of kind of greater achievement, the developers will actually give in to that sometimes. It's really harmful. I would consider easy, medium, and hard labels as not only inaccurate and problematic, but also ableist. Unintentionally ableist, I'm sure, but the impact is still there because these settings are only easy or difficult in relation to non-disabled standards, which makes the labels of difficulty that they're choosing to use inherently ableist because they center around non-disabled people as the norm. An environment that equates these gameplay modes to skill is an environment in which many gamers are just going to be left behind because they have nothing to do with skill. I would like to see someone who thinks they are try to play an FPS game like I play with my feet the way that I do when my hands aren't working well. It's difficult. Skill has nothing to do with which mode we choose. So you may be thinking then, okay, what's the solution? For sure, there are some people who these game modes are about accessibility, but for some people they aren't. What about people who just want to shake it up and try what for them is a more difficult gameplay experience? And I get that. Um, I get that for a lot of people, these modes aren't about accessibility and are really just a way for them to customize their gameplay experience in order to challenge themselves. And listen, I'm not saying to do away with customization in gaming altogether, but there are a few solutions that we can consider that don't further the exclusion of an already marginalized group of people. Oops. Oh, this slide is in a weird order. Okay. So how do we do that? First, let's consider just not having these categories for gameplay settings at all. I'm not suggesting we do away with the customizable gameplay. I'm saying that we need to broaden the customization beyond 3 static settings. This is always the preferred method in the game development industry when it comes to accessibility, because no 2 people have the same needs. In fact, often 2 disabled people will have conflicting needs. So the more customization that we offer on an individual level, the better the experience will be. The best practice is to offer just a wide range of toggleable options that people can choose to add to their own personalized gaming experience. Every gamer can choose something different. That gives us the best chance of really meeting every gamer's needs and giving them a good experience. Think character customization, but for accessibility. We've probably all played a game where you can spend a good 45 minutes before you even start just customizing what your character is going to look like. Sorry, like where they have freckles, what color their eyes are, what their body type is. We want that experience at the beginning of a game, but for accessibility options. So subtitles, do you want them? Do you want subtitles for just main characters, or do you also want to hear background conversations that the NPCs are having? Do you also want to know about a dog barking in the background? Would you like a third layer of subtitles for that? Things like that, like give people the options so that they can say, yeah, I do need a colorblind mode. I don't need the big font for my subtitles, but I do want subtitles. Let everyone customize their own experience. That's obviously preferable, but if for some reason that's not doable, maybe it's too late in the project to make that change, or you're a small studio that doesn't have the technical knowledge or budget to pull off that level of customization, then we need to at least rework the language we're using for these gameplay modes. An easy fix is to just name them something else, something that has nothing to do with difficulty. Falcon mode, eagle mode, hawk mode, square mode, circle mode, triangle mode. If you're feeling very creative, you could go with gameplay mode 1, 2, and 3. The possibilities are endless. Pick something that fits your game. The only thing that's important is to keep it non-hierarchical. Don't name it something like mouse mode, lion mode, T-Rex mode, because then we slip back into the same pattern of assigning greater value of achievement to players who can complete a game on T-Rex mode, and that's not what we want. Okay, so if we rework the language, the next question I often get is, how will people know which mode to choose? How do we know what T-Rex mode is? And it's actually very simple. Most games already do this. Simply offer a description of each mode on the selection screen. Right now on my screen, I have up a screenshot from a game called Farming Simulator 17. And unfortunately, they've done the thing where they've named their gameplay modes based on difficulty. So on the screen, you can see difficulty, easy, normal, or hard. But then what they've done, which is great, is we have normal selected on the screen here, and it says the standard starting conditions, a moderate economy, okay prices for crops, and you have a medium-sized loan at the bank. Gameplay elements are at the standard settings. So we could completely take away easy, normal, and hard and name it like potato mode, corn mode, wheat mode, and people would still know which gameplay mode they wanted to choose. This is mode 1. It has lengthened QuickTime event timers, unlimited lives, the option to skip boss fights. Game mode 2 has medium length timers. Enemies deal a moderate amount of damage. Gameplay mode 3 has very short QuickTime event timers, and there's no revives, and enemies have increased armor and attack stats. There are just so many better language choices that don't leave anyone behind. And again, this is just kind of one example of how thoughtful implementation of language can make a game more accessible to folks with disabilities. We've talked a lot about language, so I'm going to move on, but I just want to reiterate that basically it boils down to this. It's important to pay attention to what you're saying to and about disabled people with the language choices that you make in your game and in your marketing materials. If you keep that in mind, you're definitely on the right track. So my last point is about accessibility of studio culture. It's easier to create an accessible game when you're working off the jumping off point of wanting to be an overall accessible game development company, when you care about accessibility as a core tenet. There are a lot of ways that this factors in, and I can't list them all, but I'm going to go with some of the big ones that I see companies doing wrong a lot of the time. The first one is office space. You would be surprised how many game development studios have hired me to come in and do work, and then I get there and can't get in the front door with my wheelchair, and we have to figure out a different plan. Obviously, wheelchair users aren't the only people that you need to think about when creating an accessible space. And there are some really good examples out there of people who've done a really good job. The Microsoft Inclusive Tech Lab, for example, they design all of Xbox's adaptive controllers and things like that for people with disabilities. So they've gone to great lengths to make the space very accessible. They have automatic doors everywhere, extra wide doors. The contrast of colors of the furniture and carpet and walls is very high contrast for people who are low vision. They have Braille in their fridge. So if you want a Diet Coke, you reach and you get a Diet Coke. And not everyone has that budget. I get it. That's kind of the reach for the stars. Let's aim for that. But even if you don't have that, there's a company called Digital Extremes in London who developed the game Warframe and some of the BioShock games. And when I go to their studio, it doesn't have Braille in the fridge, but I can get around. I can access every area that non-disabled people can access. They put special attention into making sure that the washrooms were rated high for accessibility for people of a number of different disabilities, making sure that the hand dryers and the sink and everything are in the right spot. Things like that are really important. So yeah, office space. When I go to an office and it's not accessible, that's a big red flag. Another one that's important to keep in mind if you want your studio to be accessible is diverse hiring practices. Because not only is diversity strength, and like not only is it the right thing to do to make sure everyone has a voice, it's also just easier to make an accessible game when the people creating it have accessibility needs themselves. And I'm not just talking about like hiring an accessibility specialist who's disabled, although I do believe the people who are working in accessibility in your game, you should not have a fully non-disabled team working on accessibility. It's important to have lived experience feedback in that process, but also having disabled people work in every department, in the art department, in the QA department. So someone working in QA can be like, hey, boss, I can't see quest objectives, and that feels important. You know, you can catch things. If disabled people can't work on your game, then disabled people can't play your game. So that's really important as well. And it's also important to listen to the feedback from disabled users and communities, but not to lean too heavily on free emotional labor from these communities. People with disabilities are used to having to do a lot of free emotional labor to get our needs met. And so asking disabled gamers to come to your company and do a free panel on what it's like to be excluded from video games is not good practice without offering some sort of honorarium, payment, something. But definitely listening to feedback when you get it and not taking it too personally is a big thing. Conventions and expos are another area. Are you hosting your conventions at an accessible space? If you are giving demos of your game at an expo, do you have controller options? Do you have both standing and sitting gaming stations? I've tried to play games before that I couldn't play because they only had standing gaming stations. There's also things like accessible presentation formats, making sure that there are captions, and live captions are always preferred to the automatic captions. I'm sure people will notice that automatic captions don't accurately represent the words we're saying, especially more technical words. And also ASL. There's been this really big push since the pandemic started that some of my deaf friends and colleagues have pointed out to me, where unfortunately people are moving away from ASL interpretation because they say, well, we have subtitles. And I think a lot of people don't realize that ASL is its own entire language. Like there are people in my life who only speak ASL or who speak ASL as their first language. So saying they can come read the subtitles is like saying, oh, someone who only speaks French can come because we have English subtitles. So they'll be fun. Like it's its whole own language with its own syntax, its own rules. We really need to try our best to have both. And I make it a practice to not speak at conventions that don't have accessible formats. And so making sure you're not bringing your game to demos that aren't accessible formats either. Also, things like scent-free policies are important, making sure there are quiet spaces if people are overstimulated. These are all things to keep in mind about conventions and expos and conferences and things like that. Your accessible marketing media is a big one that a lot of people drop the ball on. Things like if you tweet out a photo of your game, did you put alt text on that photo so that people with screen readers know what's in the photo? You know, sometimes people will release PDF images of text and my screen reader can't read that because I need to be able to highlight the text to read it. So making sure that things that you're tweeting out and sharing are very, very accessible. Another important thing is making sure that information about the accessibility options of your game are accessible and are made available outside of your game in advance of its release and in an accessible format. Disabled people should not have to wait until a game comes out and then pay full price for it to find out whether or not we can even play it, right? We want the same experience as everyone else. We want to be able to buy a game on release day, sit down with our friends and just play it. So having that information that's screen reader capable also is really important. And the last point that I'm going to talk about with studio and corporate culture is affordability. Affordability is accessibility. And if you have any type of tech or adaptive devices or adaptive controllers for video games, is that affordable to the people who actually need it the most? Often disabled folks are expected to pay more for a gaming experience than everyone else. So I can't just buy an Xbox and take it home and play it. I then also have to spend a couple $100s for an Xbox adaptive controller. And then I also have to pay for maybe 18 different switch buttons to plug into that hub of the adaptive controller, which could be $50 to $200 each. And then I also have to mount those buttons. I have a bunch of buttons mounted on my desk here so that I can lean into them and lean on my armrests to play games on days when I have less motor function. And that costs money too, because, you know, as you can imagine, if I have trouble holding a standard controller, I also have trouble holding a power drill. So I had to hire someone to help me mount these. So it just becomes this exorbitant cost that other people don't have to pay to have the same experience. People will say, what about grants? You know, grants exist, but not everyone gets approved for a grant. Grants are also sometimes problematic because they can drive the price of the tech up. So it ends up being that the people who most need this tech are the least able to access it. And that's a really big problem that we need to be mindful of. So yeah, in closing, I guess we're at 36 minutes. We've got some time for questions now, but I just want to say that this presentation may have felt like it was aimed mostly at just developers and creators of games, but it's information that anyone can use to have an impact on the gaming industry. Consumers hold a lot of power when it comes to video games because we are the ones who decide who gets good reviews. We are the ones who choose which games we buy. I invite you all to be very vocal alongside me on things like Twitter and giving feedback to development companies when we see them doing a good job, and also offering constructive criticism when we see areas that could use improvement. We all have the ability to be agents for change in digital accessibility spaces, and also voting. Make sure that you're aware of who you're voting for and their take on accessibility in your area. So that's all I've got today. On the screen right now, it says questions, comments, reach me at, and I've listed some information where you can reach me. So on LinkedIn, if you're looking for me, my name is Lorelei Root. That's spelled Loreelei. My last name Root. And my email address is lorelei.root, spelled the same way, at yahoo.com. And then my Twitter is at squarest_root. SQUAREST_ROOT. I'd love to hear from you. And I'm also really involved in a lot of accessibility advocacy projects in Guelph. So if you're at all interested in lending your voice to those, feel free to find me. But yeah, Caroline, can you help me out if there are any questions? Because it's hard to get my screen reader to hop over.
Absolutely. So we have a question and a comment from Stephanie. So she says, thank you for this really awesome presentation. Do you have any thoughts on educational games that might that might use easy, medium, or hard to indicate skill level for different questions? Is this a better way?
Educational games that are using the easy, medium, and hard. I would say even for educational games, you can use the mode 1, mode 2, and mode 3. And you can say, you know, these questions are ones that you might have that more general knowledge might address. These are questions that might not be as general knowledge. And these are questions, I hope I'm understanding that question correctly. But yeah, I think the same thing goes for educational games. I don't actually know of any educational games that have these different modes. I have only ever worked on games for more young adults and teens and adults.
Perfect. We have a comment from Heather. So she said, not really a question, but you included a lot of information here that applies to the academic environment and work environment. I really appreciated your point about the emotional cost that individuals with disabilities have placed upon them by attending panelings, etc. I didn't think of that before. That is on me. I'm going to keep that in mind going forward and bring that back to my department.
Yeah, and another piece that plays in there as well that I didn't mention but should have absolutely mentioned is the intersectionality that we have to keep in mind, because I'm speaking today as a cis white disabled woman. I'm queer and I'm disabled, and that's pretty much like my experience is so much different than the experience of a black or an indigenous or a trans gamer. Like, I actually recently was on a panel with someone with a couple of creators who were black, and they were talking about the fact that, like, Lorelai, you get to say that you're angry that a game's not accessible. We don't get to say that. We don't get to just be angry, because then we get so much pushback of how dare you be so angry? You're being so aggressive. I've never had that. I've heard things like, you're being so brave. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. So make sure that you're taking into account your own biases and that sort of thing when you are taking this feedback from people, because the emotional cost is greater with the additional layers of intersecting marginalization that someone experiences.
And we've got one more from Paige. She says, fantastic presentation. I particularly loved your discussion of difficulty levels. Do you find that presenting the UI in those settings are also an issue? I would think that even listing preset modes in a linear order would suggest an increase in difficulty.
Yeah, it's important to make sure that it's not, that it's not suggesting an increase in difficulty. Mainly labeling it the language is the biggest part, because that's what's fueling this kind of negative stigma in uh in gaming spaces, but it definitely is a challenge. So having them in a linear order is definitely difficult as well. That's really why I'm a huge advocate of just doing away with these modes altogether. But anytime I tell developers to entirely do away with these modes, they tell me that that's too expensive and too difficult. But I would love people to check out games that have done it well, like Spider-Man, the most recent Spider-Man game for the PS4, or any of the post 2013 Tomb Raider games, where you go in and it has all these options for just everything you can think of. There are so many games now that are doing it really well. Last of Us. Last of Us 2 just came out with an incredibly accessible game. There was actually a game recently, and the name is escaping me, but they designed a game that's entirely playable by blind people. And sighted users can also play the game, but you just can't see any. There's nothing to see on the screen. It's an entirely auditory video game. And that's really cool. And it's very accessible for that specific community. It does present a new challenge for deaf users, though. So it's always the best option to just have as many options as you can that people can just turn on and off, because these static game modes do create problems, even as you pointed out in the UI when you're laying them out.
So we have two more comments. Erica says, I really like your description of free emotional labor. Very helpful. Thank you. And then Paige says, and thank you for recognizing the representation of trans gamers.
Yeah, for sure. Actually, in gaming spaces, a lot of trans people find a home, right? And find the ability to kind of experiment with gender things by choosing different characters and things like that. A lot of my gaming friends are trans, and I think that the gaming industry does a disservice to trans folks by not taking that into account and not having trans representation as well. And then also, you don't just have to have one or the other type of representation. A lot of, in general in life, we see people doing this wrong a lot, where they're like, we're going to have a Black person, and we're going to have a wheelchair user, and we're going to have a trans person. Like, have a Black person who uses a wheelchair, have a blind trans person represented. You don't have to be so rigid about it.
And we've got one more from Jeremy. He says, as a gamer dad to two gamers and as a PWD, I adore your deconstruction of difficulty modes. Thank you. And thank you for your plugs for alt text and increasing customization.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
So I don't see any other questions.
I also want to say I'm definitely not an authority on proper representation of trans or people of color or Black or Indigenous folks. So don't listen to me about that, but go out and find and also pay some trans people and some Indigenous and people of color to consult on that. I'm just throwing in 2 cents. Basically, I'm trying to redirect you to paying those people to teach you those things. Don't listen to me.
Excellent. Okay, well, if we don't have any more questions, I'd like to thank you all so much for joining us.